Hey everybody, JJ Cooper, Geoff Pontes, another Baseball America Prospects deep dive. We are going to look in depth at the Orioles farm system today. Our team that's probably had the best farm system in baseball in the cumulative over the last 5 years. They've been multiple times number one on our farm system talent rankings. They have produced Gunnar Henderson, Adley Rutschman, Jackson Holliday, Jordan Westburg, Grayson Rodriguez, as well as prospects who've gone on to have success elsewhere, Joey Ortiz. But we also would say that right now, as we kind of dive into this, the understandable life cycle of a farm system is happening. This is an Orioles system that we currently rank 17th on our farm system talent rankings that has a couple of truly top tier prospects at the top of it, but just doesn't probably have the depth that it's had in past years because of graduations, because of trades, because of the fact that instead of drafting 1, 2, 3, they're now drafting at the back of the first round. You throw it all together, Geoff, not the system it was a couple of years ago, but then again, this is the team that has a lot of young big league stars. And the number one prospect here is one who I would say compares pretty favorably to that group as well. Samuel Basallo, catcher Samuel Basallo. When we did a kind of an exercise last year, we were saying who could be the number one prospect in baseball in 2025 when our top 100 came out. Basallo was one of the names that we picked. He didn't reach that level. He did have an injury early in the season, but he's also not that far away from it. Like when you look at Samuel Basallo right now, does he fit in that category? This is a very lofty category of the next great Orioles prospect, or is he more of the next of the very good? Like, are we talking the next Gunnar and Adley? Are we talking the next Colton Cowser, which is still very good? Or are we talking more of like the next Ryan Mountcastle?
Yeah, I think it's probably more along the lines of Colton Cowser, maybe a tick up. Maybe he kind of sandwiches himself between those really elite guys and those, above average to very good prospects. I think offensively, in terms of what the bat is, we're talking about an above average hit tool with outlier power. It's double plus power. He hits the ball hard. He hits it in the air fairly consistently. He does that without having to sacrifice the hit tool. And he's not without defensive value. He's not a great catcher back there. The glove is going to have to improve. The framing, the blocking, all that sort of stuff. It's a huge arm. It's a double plus arm. He's always sort of had that. I don't think they're looking to move him off the position just based on how they've handled him. It's mostly been, the days that he's off from catching, he's DHing. There's a chance that maybe he gets some time at first base, and the bat is certainly enough to handle it there. But I don't think that him catching long term is totally out the window. But you do have Adley Rutschman to compete with. So the big question there is, how does he sort of fit into that platoon situation? Does he start to see more at bats at first base? And then DH maybe in the major leagues. Mountcastle could be out the door in the next year or two. Certainly some of that stuff within the major league roster can change, but he's young enough that he can still sort of marinate a little bit in AAA, get more minor league time, go through a full healthy season, and maybe forces his way up to the major leagues by the end of the year and can contribute in one way, shape, or form. The thing with the Orioles is they just consistently have so many players and so much depth, particularly positionally right now, that maybe some trades happen, maybe some things naturally happen with some injuries and time opens itself up. Don't think it's necessarily going to be like the franchise everyday catcher because they have that guy. Adley Rutschman, I believe, over his first 3 years has produced more WAR than any first 3 years of any catcher's career. So just to put that into historical context, he is a very good player. This team started to win and sort of the personality of this team really changed once Rutschman came up. So I think he's just really invaluable to that organization. But Basallo has such offensive upside that I think he can fit into a multitude of different roles and positions. And it might be spending time, like I said, between 3 different positions.
Two other things with that jump out to me. One is this is a team that's planning, as we record this, to have Gary Sanchez as the backup catcher. Okay. That tells me something that kind of creates the possibility where if you said, could Samuel Basallo as one of his roles be the backup catcher, even if his defense is solid, not spectacular? Okay. That Gary Sanchez, I would say as a general rule, you would say that his defense is adequate at best. You're not going to say that you're bringing Gary Sanchez. You're bringing Gary Sanchez because the bat is solid to go with, again, playable catching defensively. So that's one. Two, as you mentioned, I do think that the way that some of these moves have worked for the Orioles kind of is creating more of an opportunity for Basallo to kind of fill that hybrid role. You mentioned Mountcastle. Ryan O'Hearn, we don't know how many more years Ryan O'Hearn will be part of this. And then obviously Anthony Santander, who plays some outfield, but also kind of fit into that DH mix, left in free agency as well. You put all this together, by the time Basallo's ready, like there could be that this is one of the positions that opens up a little bit where you say, okay, it's not hard to figure out a way to get him to 500 plate appearances, which for someone who is catching even part-time is a significant role. In the next year or two, it's not crazy to think that those opportunities could arise. Now, we're going to get into another prospect here that could kind of cloud that first base DH, another elite prospect for the Orioles. But if you said that Basallo ends up playing a kind of a multitude of positions, including catcher, I think the key thing, Geoff, that stands out here, you talked about it a little bit already, is this is the guy who his offensive potential is such that you're hoping, if you're the Orioles and if you're Samuel Basallo and you're an Orioles fan, you're hoping that at some point by late this season even, you just have to figure out a way to get him in the lineup because that's what kind of offensive potential he has if this all clicks, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I think this is as exciting as a bat as they've probably had, just from a pure combination or blend of hit tool and power as they've had since Gunnar Henderson. He doesn't have all the tools and the quick twitch sort of abilities and game that Henderson has. Obviously, Henderson's going to be on, the left side of that infield for a very long time.
It's a 7-war player.
Yeah, exactly. But I think just in terms of carrying, the middle of the order, maybe he can develop almost into like a Yordan Alvarez sort of bat. Like that's the ceiling that we're looking at here. I don't think he necessarily gets there. It's probably a 20% chance. I mean, that's one of the best hitters we've seen over the last decade. But I do think he has, that blend of skills, as I mentioned. And, if that guy ends up being DH and he catches twice a week for you and can spell Adley Rutschman, a few times a week or, against left-handers, maybe they give Adley a little bit more rest. I think it's very possible that, we're looking at a guy in Basallo that, does significant damage and, could be a 30 home run bat without giving you, a 230 average. I really think the ability is certainly there. It's just a matter of, how everything sort of develops over the next year or so, but he could push his way up there and be, another big power bat in this lineup that adds a little bit more impact to the middle of the order.
Right. Like if you said like offensively, like for the Orioles, I would say that he has the potential to basically replace Anthony Santander and be better. Better on base percentage, better batting average, but with similar type of power. That also does fit into the question of, okay, how much is he going to catch? He's 6'5", 250. Like that is not your profile of your typical catcher. He's just, he's big for any position. You put him at first base, he's one of the bigger first basemen in baseball. You put him in the outfield, he's one of the bigger outfielders in baseball. You put him behind the plate, he's one of the absolute biggest catchers that we've ever seen behind the plate. So that's kind of where this all works in. But as you said, the power here is real, and he doesn't have to. A lot of guys get to that power by basically saying it's all in on that. I will admit I will sacrifice contact ability. I will sacrifice plate coverage, but I get my pitch. I drive it. Basallo is the kind of guy who has the chance to say, like, I'm not going to sell out for it. I'm going to hit, but the ball's just going to leave the park because that's who I am, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing is there's not a lot of left-handed hitting catchers either. It's like the one position where you see a lot more right-handed and switch hitters than you probably see left-handed catchers. So kind of it's a really unusual profile. And, maybe that ends up pushing him to first base long-term, especially with, Mountcastle, I think, a year or two away from free agency. I think it's certainly a possibility.
But it is also kind of crazy that, okay, and you would normally say, oh, the left-handed hitting catcher, well, so he can be the main side of the platoon. Well, Adley Rutschman obviously switch hitter, and on top of that, you don't really, again, I know he had a bad end of last year, but if Adley Rutschman, you don't really want him. You don't want him playing 150 games in an ideal world, because you want him fresh come October, because you're expecting that you're going to be playing playoff games as well. But you also don't want him playing 120 either. So like, this is something where this is not just going to be a straight job share by any stretch of the imagination. But when you say about that combination of power and hitting ability and on base ability, the other elite prospect that I would say that the Orioles have right now that's still a prospect is their number 2 prospect, Coby Mayo. Okay, you've been a Mayo fan for a very long time. If you're comparing him and Basallo offensively, we'll get to the defense in a minute, but just as hitters, there are a lot of kind of similarities, aren't there, as far as what they could be?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit more on base ability with Mayo, a little bit more hit tool with Basallo. But, they can go toe to toe. I mean, if you had these guys next to each other in batting practice, they could have some real battles in a home run contest, right? I mean, they have sort of that double plus power. It's easy. They get to it consistently. And I think, it's similar questions as well. Where does he end up defensively? There's a lot of questions around how the glove fits in. Another guy with a big arm, just like Basallo, it kind of tracks with guys that have 70 power. They usually have plus arms or double plus arms. So he's another one where I think you could kind of make a case. Maybe his best position is first base or just DH/hitter. It's how does all that come together? I know that you've done more work, I think, on Coby Mayo's defense than anybody outside of probably Coby Mayo's defensive coach and the Orioles organization themselves.
The arm's great, but it also can be inaccurate at times. I don't think that's a major problem. Usually those problems kind of alleviate themselves as players get more experience. But also, like, when it comes to first base, I do think if first base is going to be his quickest path to the big league, which, I mean, as we record this, it's kind of an open question, because this is a team where if everyone's healthy, it's hard to figure out. Like with Basallo, we just laid it out, right? He's not ready yet. You're not worried about him. He could hit 400 with 10 bombs during the spring training, and you'd still say he's ticketed for AAA, because they're going to want him to get a little bit more seasoning, especially behind the plate. Coby Mayo's arguably big league ready. Like, he's had enough time in AAA that it is hard to say, oh, he needs more seasoning, especially at the plate. But he's not as good as Jordan Westburg at third base. And he's probably never going to be as good as Jordan Westburg at third base. Okay. Well, you say, well, you could move Westburg to second, because Westburg could play there too if you wanted to get Mayo in the lineup. But, well, you got Holiday, you got Jackson Holiday, and I know that Holiday didn't set the world on fire last year, but he's Jackson Holiday. There is every reason in the world to say, you're our second baseman. We're expecting a great year from you. Westburg could play short in a pinch. You just laid it out. You're not moving Gunnar Henderson. So if those guys are all healthy, second base, shortstop, and third base are full. Okay, well, what about first base? Well, you got Ryan Mountcastle and Ryan O'Hearn. And so I'm not saying that there's not a scenario where Coby Mayo ends up being better than Ryan Mountcastle. That's very possible. But one, he's not all that comfortable at first base yet. When I watched him last year at first base, the way I would describe it is you could see times where it was like, first base is hard. Like, for all the talk of, first base is easier. If you aren't a first baseman, there's a lot to it. And there's a lot to it. Tell him, Wash, it's hard. It's really hard. Well, there were times where you could see him kind of be in between. Like, am I supposed to go field that? Am I supposed to go cover the bag? Things like that, where I would say more than anything, he just needed more reps. So he probably needs more reps. But even if they give him a lot of reps in spring training, if everyone's healthy, you could say, well, Ryan O'Hearn can play a little bit in the outfield, but he's not playing the outfield with Tyler O'Neill and Colton Cowser and Cedric Mullins and Heston Kjerstad and Ramon Laureano. Like, that's not really an opening right now. So it does seem very possible that Coby Mayo could spend more time in AAA, kind of waiting for, no, injuries happen, right? And the thing I'll say about this is, this does give you a lot of depth in that, okay, Westberg missed some time last year. If that happened this year, I think you do give Mayo a shot at saying, okay, let's see what you can do at third base. If an injury happens at first base or one of those guys goes down, you can say, okay, let's see what you can do at first base. And by the way, let's probably get you some DH at bats as well. If it's hard for me to say if one outfielder, but if multiple outfielders go down, right? Like if Kierstad's out and Kauser's out, then maybe some DH at bats kind of come open with that or whatever. But again, right now, when I look at it, I don't know about you, Geoff, but when I look at it, it's like if you said, where's Coby Mayo going to play in 2025? The short answer right now is still probably AAA Norfolk, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of other factors here. And that is if the Orioles do decide to make a big trade between spring training and the trade deadline, if he's hitting enough and they feel confident enough, maybe they try to work a platoon because he is right-handed hitting. O'Hearn is left-handed hitting, doesn't hit, left-handers very well. Maybe he starts to hit more often against in those left-handed matchups. Maybe he gets some starts at DH in those games. They start to work him a little bit at first base. Maybe Mountcastle with 2 years left is, the major league piece in a trade that they swing for a pitcher. They still need a potential ace here. They've signed some depth pieces that are in their rotation. A lot of those guys are pretty old. Charlie Morton is as old as he is.
Charlie Morton would call himself old, I think, at this point.
Exactly. Like he's so old that, the only guy that's older than him that we've seen in the last couple of years is like Rich Hill and like Verlander.
And Tomoyuki Sugano, who they signed out of Japan, is also like, he's 35. Like he's not someone where you're like, oh, the upside. No, he's a veteran.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think that there could be a deal to be made. I know the Cease thing has been talked about ad nauseum. They have the pieces to maybe package some of this depth, some of the redundancy that they have in the organization without really cutting their legs out in terms of the depth that they need in case of an injury. There's some players here that could be moved, could be shuffled around. And, Mountcastle, certainly with 2 years left in his deal, could be one. And, the last year's an ARB year, and it's not like he set the world on fire, but somebody needs some right-handed power, needs a new first baseman. First baseman goes down. He potentially gets moved. They could move O'Hearn to first base, start to give Mayo some reps there, and maybe Mayo moves into a more predominantly a DH role and then sort of spelling Westberg here and there.
Again, we don't know. As we record this, no trades have been made, which does mean that even though we're going to turn this around pretty quick, that probably means a massive trade's happening in the next few hours. But the other thing I would say with that is, I don't even think it's Mountcastle guys. It would be, but like if you said that the Orioles make a big trade at some point this year, could it be one of their established young veterans who are now, Colton Cowser's already established himself in the big leagues, but a Colton Cowser, a Jordan Westberg, someone like that, where it's like, okay, and then all of a sudden this depth, or again, it could be, a Basallo or a Mayo. Now, the thing that does jump out here is there are less of these pieces. They've made these trades. Like for all the talk of, why haven't the Orioles been more aggressive? It is worth noting that Corbin Burnes trade, that was expensive in prospect terms, right? Joey Ortiz is a big league regular. Now, we would be talking about Joey Ortiz the same way with Baltimore that we just did with Coby Mayo. Ortiz can play 3 infield positions really well. I still don't know if he's playing for the Orioles because, again, maybe he's playing at second base and they're giving Holiday some more time to develop. But he's not. Again, it's hard to move Gunnar, and it's even hard to move Westberg right now. DL Hall it'd be nice to have him, but he's injury prone. They may have been selling, trading at a smart time there. They did a trade, a Trevor Rogers trade. They did a Zach Eflin trade where they traded, multiple prospects, Jackson Baumeister. They traded Matt Horvath. They traded Connor Norby. They traded Kyle Stowers, who really wouldn't fit for this team right now either. So they've made a lot of moves that have thinned out this system to some extent. And, that's what we want to dive into next. If you're enjoying this, we promise you that you will enjoy baseballamerica.com. We have a full scouting reports for all 30 Orioles top 30 prospects with BA grades, tools grades. By the way, we have that also for every year of the 21st century. So if you want to, when we talk about that 2023 Orioles top 30, you want to go back and look at it. Easy just to change the year from 2025 to 23 and go, oh, Gunnar Henderson was number one. Which, by the way, if you want us to kind of show our work a little bit here, which I like doing, like we like to analyze what we're doing, kind of, make sure that we're doing this right. But so here's our Orioles top. I'll just do top 10 from 2023. Gunnar Henderson, 1. He's a big leaguer now. Grayson Rodriguez, 2. Big leaguer for the Orioles. Jackson Holliday, 3. Big leaguer for the Orioles. Colton Cowser, 4. Big leaguer for the Orioles. DL Hall traded in that Corbin Burns trade to the Brewers. Jordan Westberg, 6. He's a big leaguer with the Orioles. Connor Norby, 7, traded to the Marlins. Joey Ortiz, 8, traded to the Brewers, the Burns trade. Kyle Stowers, 9, traded to the Marlins. Coby Mayo, we just talked about. That's your top 10. When you say like only one of those top 10 is still in the organization and still prospect eligible from a couple of years ago. So if you say, well, why is this Orioles system thinner? It's because they graduate a lot of guys, and that's after graduating an Adley Rushman and guys like that. So, but if you enjoy that, you will enjoy everything at baseballamerica.com. You can join the subscribers there who get all this content, and we appreciate our subscribers for what you do. We're going to dive in more about how all this fits together for the Orioles in 25 and beyond after this quick break. So, Geoff, we've just laid it out. There are still some log jams here. But as I'm kind of looking ahead, like the rough thing for the Orioles right now is, I would say that of the prospects and recently graduated prospects, the players that they could use the biggest step forward from at some point in 2025. We saw Cade Povich reach the big leagues last year, but he has not settled in, right? He's renting right now, not buying, because he hasn't shown that he's an established member of that rotation yet. And we don't know on that. And then the other guy is Chase McDermott, who is also kind of a guy who's kind of been on that, you can make an argument that at some point you're hoping that he could maybe step into the rotation at some point. He does have a lat injury already in spring training. It's going to slow it a little bit further. But to look on that pitching side, is there help coming on the pitching side, or is it more is going to have to come from the guys coming off of the injured list? Kyle Bradish is probably the most notable one, who could be back later this season at some point. Is it going to have to be coming from that, or is it going to have to be coming externally, or are there some guys here who could help fill out this rotation this year?
I think it's probably going to have to come externally. When I look at McDermott, there's big stuff there. He's got, I think, 4 pitches that grade is like above average or better on our tool grades. Command isn't great. The execution isn't great. He's not consistently getting deep into starts. That certainly is a question mark. Could he help in the short term? Sure. I think that, over a full season would probably be exposed. And, he's already dealing with injuries early in spring training. That's kind of been a theme from him over the last couple of years. He dealt with a stress fracture in his right shoulder last year, late in the season. And, you sort of got to wonder, is it how he pitches? He has sort of big stuff. He kind of throws like a reliever. Maybe asking him to throw too many innings and to start isn't the right fit. I think he's probably more of a bullpen weapon that can go multiple innings for you, handle, some big leverage outs. I think that's where he's best. I think Povich, he's a crafty lefty, but the stuff is not big. And that's always a major question mark when you're, stepping into the AL East, stepping into a competitive team that has, championship aspirations. So, I think it could come, but probably in a much smaller impact role for both of them, where Povich is probably more like your number 5, number 6 starter, depending upon the injuries and that sort of thing. McDermott is probably more of a spot starter that's going to go 4 or 5 innings, and you're probably best using him, as I said, to get 4 or 5 times a week. I think it's probably going to have to come externally, and it's once again going to be, packaging together multiple players and, sort of turning them into, a bigger player, some ponies for a horse sort of trade.
So The other thing that just stands out to me is we've talked about Heston Kjerstad is still prospect eligible for us. He has not reached the at bat limit yet, although I know he's had enough service time that if you're using service time, he's not rookie of the year eligible, I don't believe at this point. But the time is now for Kjerstad. And again, I don't know how well he's going to fit in this, but he's old enough at this point. You really can't look at Kjerstad, who's going into his age 26 season, and say, oh, again, there's no more seasoning needed here. It's a question of what are you going to get? After that, you get this system thins out. But the thing I will say, if you asked me to kind of project this out and you said, who's the other guy coming up who kind of fits in this lineup? This is the team that's kind of doubled down on center fielders a lot lately, but it does feel like Enrique Bradfield, Cedric Mullins, this is his final year before he hits free agency. Colton Cowser can play center. There are a ton, as we just laid out, of corner outfielders here. But if I look at it, I would say that Enrique Bradfield, because of his defense, because of his speed, he probably, more than, again, Vance Honeycutt has a more well-rounded tool set. Dylan Beavers has probably, has better power than Enrique Bradfield. I feel comfortable saying that. But the rest of these guys don't really have. What I would say with Bradfield is, when I'm looking at it, he's the guy who makes the most sense to me. And by the way, they've also doubled down on a whole lot of veterans, right? So Dylan Carlson is part of this group of could be going to AAA. Daz Cameron, I think dropped off the 40-man, but got him to accept the assignment. Jordan Adams, there's some guys here on this as well. But it does seem to me like Bradfield is the one. If you ask me who's the other guy in this top 10 who could be starting for them in a year or two, the thing that just stands out to me about Bradfield is that he's the guy who fits a position that they need. What is your sense? I sense some skepticism there, maybe, or maybe I'm reading you wrong.
No, I mean, I was kind of just laughing at the remember some guys. Daz Cameron, Nick Gordon is in this organization.
Judd Fabian, I should have mentioned also, who's also an Orioles dude. Who's a center fielder.
Adams, Franklin Barreto, I didn't even realize was still playing baseball in America. All of these guys are kind of in the mix there. But I think ultimately you're right. I think, this probably isn't the year for Enrique Bradfield to break into that lineup full time. But when you're talking about sort of, holding the fort in terms of great defensive value, we have him as an 80 center fielder. He stands out there. There's certainly defensive value there, but we have seen guys like this come up and struggle. It's better, more pedigree than a Victor Scott. So it's funny to sort of compare the two, but it's a similar profile. There's not a lot of power here. It's hit first. It's a lot of speed. If he gets on base, he's going to be able to steal, if he hits 300 in the big leagues, he's going to steal 80 bags or something. I mean, he's that sort of base stealer, elite center field defender. And I think when you look at it long term, if they're getting offensive production from so many other spots, if he can be more of a table setter, a run producer, a guy that, wreaks havoc once he's on base and just holds down the fort and plays great defensive center field, I think he's got an opportunity to sort of push in there. But we've seen a lot of these guys that have this profile where there's not a lot of impact in the bat, and the center field defense and the speed is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Some of those guys don't cut it once they get up to the big league. We've seen, Christian Pache was different. He wasn't the base stealer, but certainly, Ballyhoot is a great defender. We thought defender, an average hit tool or better. That sort of didn't work out. As I mentioned, Victor Scott, we'll see how, Chandler Simpson sort of plays out, though they're different. He's obviously a much better defender than Chandler Simpson is, but I'd say Chandler Simpson's probably a better hitter and a better base runner even than Enrique Bradfield is. So it's a weird profile in the modern game. 30, 40 years ago, there were a lot of center fielders like this, and I think would, had a lot of utility. It's just, how does this fit in? They have enough offensive firepower in other spots that if I had to pick amongst these center fielders as to, who the heir apparent is in center after Cedric Mullins leaves, it's probably Enrique Bradfield, because he's at least sort of treaded water offensively and shown something, unlike Judd Fabian and some of the other guys.
The thing I would say with that, yeah, is that like also the other part of this is that, and there's a reason I think that the Orioles go after a lot of these kind of hybrid center fielders is even with the fences being moved back in to some extent, this is a park that plays pretty big and that you need to have guys who can cover some ground, not just in center field, but you need to probably have at least one. Going back, Austin Hayes kind of filled this for quite a while, I think, as well. Like that quasi center fielder who's playing in a corner as well. They like to have kind of, this is a very run prevention approach, a very Rays approach. Also, the Rays always have, I feel like, guys in the corners who are at least 55s in center as well. That's where I think Bradfield does stand out. But when you get past that, the thing that stands out here is, we just mentioned a couple of years ago when you were talking about Heston Kjerstad was on the outside of the top 10 looking in, and that was a first round pick who we liked, right? Like this is something where Joey Ortiz was at the back of the top 10 and was a top 100 prospect just a couple of years ago. Now, Bradfield's not a top 100 prospect, and you get past him, Dylan Beavers, Judd Fabian, shortstop Griff O'Farrell, those are guys who all kind of, I would say, face questions about whether whether offensively they're going to do enough to be regulars. This is just not that same top 10, which again makes some sense. But I would say that Orioles fans, you need to prepare for the fact that this isn't that same list where you're just like, well, we've just got more guys than there's room to play. Still, to some extent, we just talked about it with Basallo and Mayo, but the numbers are getting a lot smaller now as far as this guy, we'll see with Vance Honeycutt. But I would say at this time, like the Judd Fabians of the world, I would say it's more skeptical that this guy's going to be a regular than like, slam dunk everyday player, right?
Yeah, I 100% agree on that. I think, as we start to get further down this top 10, particularly after Bradfield at 6, I think with the position players, with guys like Beaver, Fabian, O'Farrell, there's definitely some major question marks, and it starts to become a lot more pitching heavy once we get from 11 to 30 on.
And we just mentioned, now part of this also, I think, is by design. Like I know that there are a lot of Orioles fans who are not happy about the trade with the Marlins, but if you look at those trades that they made, when you trade Mac Horvath to the Rays, and you trade Connor Norby, and you trade Kyle Stowers, now we're going to see this year whether those guys are regulars, right? The Marlins are going to have, if I will say it this way, if those guys aren't regulars for the Marlins this year, then they're not regulars. Because if you look at that lineup, there is no one standing in their way, basically. That is the most crackable lineup in the big leagues, and I'm including the White Sox right now. I'm including whoever you want to mention. But that said, they weren't going to fit necessarily for the Orioles. But now again, it's thinning out. And when you look at it big picture with this, I think I'm a little bit more bullish than you are. Like the East is the East, right? Like the Yankees just made the World Series, and then they did lose Juan Soto, but they also doubled down on pitching. I would say their lineup has a lot of questions, but they should really be able to pitch. You look at the Red Sox, and the Red Sox have been very aggressive this offseason. And I know that they have not been part of this discussion, but I would say that they're back in that discussion. They added Crochet, they added Bregman. They have an Orioles-esque farm system where you're saying Roman Anthony and Christian Campbell and Marcelo Meyer are all knocking on the door. You look at the Rays, who are getting a lot of the pitchers back, who they kind of took a step back last year, but they're now going to have Shane McClanahan back. They should have a rotation that kind of puts them back in that. They've been a pretty perennial playoff contender. The Blue Jays went out and spent some this offseason. It's a very difficult division. Is this team feel like they've made the playoffs last 2 years? Their next big step is they need to make a run in the playoffs. Is this team positioned to make a run?
I think it really comes down to how the pitching performs. Certainly in a single season, in a vacuum, this could all work. They get sort of the final great swan song season from Charlie Morton. He stays healthy. Sagano is, a better pitcher than the money that he got in the open market. Zach Eflin stays healthy, into September and October and is able to handle 180, 190 total innings, including the playoffs. Grayson Rodriguez, I think, is the big X factor here. Rodriguez takes a step forward, and we know he has the ability to, but he's always been somebody that, has had trouble staying healthy and staying on the mound for a full season. He's still very young. I think it's possible that a lot of those things could happen, and we could look back on this a year and sort of laugh and say, they won the ALCS and lost to the Dodgers in 5 games in the World Series. We're just assuming the Dodgers win in every one of these scenarios, but I think that's totally possible. And I think if you're an Orioles fan, just getting to the ALCS, maybe making a World Series, that's really what the goal is at this point. You'd love to see them win a championship. They're young enough that you have to get over that first hump, that first hurdle, and we've seen it throughout sports history, right? Where going to basketball, Jordan's Bulls had to get over the hump of beating the Pistons, or LeBron had to get over the hump of sort of beating whoever it was. It's like there's always that team in the way, and right now it's kind of the Yankees, but we'll see. They certainly have had and put together regular seasons over the last years that would tell you they're a championship level team. They still have the offensive firepower. They're a pretty good team defensively, but some things definitely have to go right for them and maybe outperform the projections and what we're seeing from them. But, comparing last year's team to this year's team, I would say that they got worse.
The thing I would say about it is 2 things. One, the key thing this year is, if you said, why could they be better? It would be that they've now kind of integrated even more of this young core, right? Like if you said that Jackson Holliday in year 2 in the big leagues is like not going to be a star. I'm not saying you don't need him to be a star this year, but if he's like a high on base, good defensive second baseman who kind of is a table setter type, right? Who, posts a 360, 370 on base, gets on base a lot, shows occasional power, hits for enough average, steals some bases, does all those things. And all of a sudden you're talking about, okay, so now pretty much we're getting above average offensive contributions from every infield spot. I think it's going to be interesting to see, like I mentioned, Kyle Bradish, Tyler Wells, both coming off of Tommy John surgeries. The timing of when they had them, like, you're not going to have them for a while, but you might have them come August, come September. And so that's almost like if you get a healthy Kyle Bradish at that point, like a pretty healthy one, that's like making a deadline move, right? Like if you could stay in the race until then and you said, okay, who's our playoff rotation? Kyle Bradish is part of your play. Like in an ideal world, if you said, again, maybe I'm asking a little too much of him to make him their number 1 in a year. He's coming off TJ. But if you said Bradish, Grayson, and Eflin, and then you said the ageless Charlie Morton is your number 4 starter in the postseason, okay. If you said Felix Bautista now, like Felix Bautista back in Yainer Cano, and their ability to always build a bullpen means they have a strong bullpen again. Okay. So we're starting to get kind of where they could get to this. And they do still have enough pieces. Like I would say that at this point, one of the things you can say about the depth that they've built is they're going to be able to trade off this big league club if they need to, or they're going to be able to trade, like, again, I don't think that you're not trading. You didn't sign Ramon Laureano to trade him. He's not going to have a whole lot of value. We know that level of outfielder does not have a value in trade. But if you said, okay, I don't think they're going to trade Cedric Mullins, but if you said that, come late season, like, hey, a team really wanted Mullins, or if you said, hey, we don't really want to give up Samuel Basallo, but this is going to get us that ace that we need at the front of the rotation. Well, Samuel Basallo would be one of the best trade chips available out there. Coby Mayo would be one of the best trade chips available out there. Heston Kjerstad would not be one of the best. He would be a useful trade chip, but like that's where I would say like that you don't have that same. If you're going to do it this year, it's not going to be because you traded guys where Joey Ortiz was a top 100 prospect. When you traded him, though, if you're an Orioles fan, you're like, we didn't really necessarily have room for him. Now it's going to hurt a little bit more. You don't have the redundancy like that, but this still is a team that, is very logically. Again, other thing I should throw out is this: Adley Rutschman plays better than he did in the second half last year. That's not crazy to expect. Jordan Westbrook's healthy more than he was last year. These are all things that you could say, okay, this is how you map it out. Before we wrap it up, we love finishing up with this. We'll each do one of these today. But Geoff, who's a non-top 10 prospect? And again, this is a little tougher exercise for the Orioles this year. There have been some years it's like, this Heston Kjerstad guy who's not in the top 10. I know he's had myocarditis, but he was a top of the first round pick. I kind of like him. We're not picking those guys this year for the non-top 10. That's not where we're living right now. So, Geoff, who's a non-top 10 prospect who jumps out?
Yeah, I'm going to go real cheap here and go with their number 11 prospect. I could even argue that this guy could maybe be as high as 7 on this list. I think the upside is definitely there. It's Nestor Herman, who they had landed in the 2023 draft. I think it was in the 11th round. I'd double check on that one. But out of the University of Seattle, which I don't know if you realize this, the University of Seattle just had an alumnus that won the AL Cy Young and Tarek Skubal. This guy is another very interesting pitcher. When I dig into the data, this is a guy that pops for me. The fastball only sits 93 to 94 miles per hour, but he gets well above average ride. He averaged 19 and a half inches IVB this season with some cut on the fastball. It's a fairly high spin fastball, averaging about 2,500 RPMs, getting that kind of movement. He's not a super kind of a short strider. It's not super extension. It's not crazy outlier release height or anything like that. But that movement on that pitch is so outlier that it's very unique. I think there's potentially more power that could come in this frame as well. He spins it really efficiently. He's got a whole variety of secondaries in, a power curveball in the low 80s with a ton of depth. The separation between, the IVB and his fastball and the IVB and the curveball is like 35, 36 inches. It's a significant drop down between the two. It's a higher spin pitch. He does a really good job of, killing lift. He kind of turned his changeup into a splitter. That's really what it is now, is a mid-80s splitter. It's got good separation, both vertically and in terms of the velocity off of the fastball. He mixes in a harder cutter that sits in the high 80s, sometimes can be as high as, 89 to 90, 91 miles per hour. And then more of a straight slider in the mid to low 80s. So he's got a whole variation of secondary pitches, really interesting shapes. Dealt with some injuries and some nicks and bruises throughout the season, so they kind of handled him with kid gloves a little bit. But if he can prove that he can add more horsepower and consistently get deeper into starts, this is a player here that's lurking that even throughout all the different organizations we've talked about, this is a player that I'll probably have pegged, as a breakout and on my breakout teams this offseason, because I really do like Nestor Herman quite a bit.
I'm going to go with one a little further down, so we don't just go 11 and 12 here. And so I'll go with Leandro Arias, who was one of, again, the Orioles. One of the big things that the Orioles have done in recent years is they no longer have unilaterally disarmed from signing international players, which is kind of still one of the most inexplicable things of the 2010s, where it's like, nope, we just don't spend money in the international and in the Latin American market. Why would we do that? And it's like, because a lot of good players come from there. That might be, and by the way, you don't get, again, they did manage to trade some bonus allotment, but that is something that has changed. And Arias is an example of that. He was one of their top targets in 2022. And I wouldn't say they had a great season last year. He reached A-ball as a 19-year-old, struggled at times, but also showed aptitude, showed a well-rounded skill set. He's not the biggest guy. He's not the toolsiest guy you'll ever see, but he can play short, can play second, he could probably play third if he needed to too. And, again, we said this is a thinner 11 through 30 here. Like, if you ask me for an Orioles fan, like, well, what does he kind of remind you of? There's some Cesar Prieto. He's taller than Prieto, but there's some Prieto, skills here where you say profile-wise, what does you think he could end up as? Prieto was a guy who was very much blocked for the Orioles. When we talk about, you were behind Holiday and Gunnar and Westberg and Mayo and, Joey Ortiz. Cesar Prieto needed to be traded. He was traded the Jack Flaherty trade. Arias is a guy who could be that kind of multiple position, useful, probably not a regular, could be a regular, but he's a guy to keep an eye on. I think, he could have a better age 20 year than he had in 2024 as a 19-year-old. There's a nice skill set there. Again, I know that that's not the same as maybe, Orioles fans are used to when we talk about non-top 10 prospects, but he is a guy who intrigues me and a guy I think is well worth keeping an eye on. There is still a lot here to really, again, we don't want to dump on it too much because it is, any organization would love to have a Samuel Basallo topping the list. Any organization would love to have a Coby Mayo at the top of this list. It's still a really good top tier to this Orioles farm system. Just again, a lot of graduations, some trades, not drafting at the top, not as much depth as there was, but it should be a very interesting year. We'll be keeping track of it at Baseball America all year. For Geoff, I'm JJ. So long, everybody.